to occur will actually work well in practice. If you choose this option, you would then enter the details of the previous enduring powers of attorney, so you would maybe do it like this: my enduring power of attorney dated whatever the date is in favour of whoever it is. And you could enter as many of those as are applicable. But we're going to keep it really simple, and we're going to say we just want to wipe out any previous powers of attorney. The next thing to do is to look at the scope of the power, so whether it is to apply for all of the donor's property affairs, generally in relation to a specified part of the donor's property affairs, or only in relation to specified things on the donor's behalf. And so if we go with this more narrow approach, you'll see the text that's going to be here is you can only do the following things, and you'll have to build that up according to whatever the donor's specific wishes are. If it's generally in relation to a specified part of the donor's property affairs, then you're going to be able to see text like this. And if it's generally in relation to the whole of the donor's property affairs, then there's nothing further specifically to add. And so this really depends on who it is that you're giving the power to and the degree of trust and confidence that the donor has in the attorney. You can see the guidance a little more clearly on the pop-up, and we just scroll through there and see all the options. The thing to note, which is highlighted down here, is that if you are choosing one of the more specific options, you just need to make sure that you're not unnecessarily limiting what's going to be able to happen, and that the attorney won't have an important power that they need to look after the donor's property affairs at the time they really need it. The next thing to consider is whether or not the family court should be able to authorise the attorney to make a will for the donor if the donor is no longer capable of making one. A lot of people's first inclination is going to be select no for that, they want to make the will for themselves and not have the attorney able to do that. There are pros and cons with either approach on this. There might be situations that could arise where the donor either hasn't made a will, or the will that they've made isn't going to achieve the effect that they want in the circumstances. And there could be, for example, that they've made a specific gift of their house to one of the children under their will, but they need to sell the house in order to go into a rest home. And so if the house no longer exists, then potentially the way the will is drafted, that gift might fail and that child might miss out, when ideally the will might be written in a different way to make sure that the child is able to at least get the proceeds that are left from that home. Or there could be tax issues in the way that something has been structured, which could be avoided for a much better outcome. So giving the the attorney the power to make the will might be a sensible option, because these are subject to the scrutiny of the family court, and so there are safeguards in the process anyway, and so potentially it is worth thinking about selecting yes for this answer. That then brings us to the optional provisions section, and there are a number of options that you can select. You don't have to select any of them, in which case you could select none of the above and you'd move straight forward to the next section. But sometimes these may be useful to include, and some of them are actually very recommended. The first is whether you want to specify conditions and restrictions on the attorney's powers in terms of what they can or can't do using the power of attorney. The next is the appointment of successor attorneys, and so you might want to have somebody or one or more people waiting in the background who can step in if your original attorneys are either unable or unwilling to fulfill the role, so that the donor isn't left short at the time they really need someone to look after them, that the people they'd originally intended aren't there, and the power of attorney would fail. In terms of checks and balances, you might want the attorneys to have to consult with certain other people about certain things, which before they can make decisions, so that they're doing it on an informed basis, and other important people who don't necessarily have the full obligations and rights of the attorney can still have an input into the process. Or another approach would be to require that the attorney has to give information to certain people on the exercise of the powers, which would again help with transparency and making sure that they're acting appropriately. You need to decide whether or not the attorney should have authority to use the donor's property to provide celebratory gifts or make charitable donations. And finally, there's an option for additional terms and conditions, which would enable any other provisions that you want to include to be set out into the power of attorney as well. You'll see as we've ticked all of these that further boxes have opened up down the left-hand side of the screen, and so those either appear or disappear depending on whether they're relevant or not. Now we can see in the questions here that we've got, because we've chosen consultation and information, that this could apply for either all attorneys or just for a successor attorney, and this is really getting at whether or not the successor attorneys may not have the same degree of full trust and confidence of the donor that the original attorneys would. So you can choose a different approach for different attorneys. So looking now at the first option that we've chosen under the optional provisions, which was to add a condition or restriction on the attorney's power. So this is very, I guess, context specific. You can see that the wording that will go in looks like this, and so you can then choose as many different repeats to go under the description as you would like. And a condition that you might enter here could be along the lines that the attorney can only sell the home and whatever the address is if certain named people agree. So that would be a hard restriction on the ability of the attorney to be able to sell the house. And you could enter as many as you would like there. Now in this case I'm going to change my mind about the relevance of this, and I'm going to say I don't want to include that because I'll cover it off with a consultation obligation. So I could turn that condition off, which will hide that. The next thing that we need to do is to appoint a successor attorney, because we've said that we want to do that under the optional provisions, and we can have one or more successor attorneys that can be appointed. You'll note there's some guidance here about how this will work in practice. This process allows for appointment of one successor attorney at a time. So when one original attorney's appointment ends, one new attorney will be appointed, one in, one out. Now you can perhaps decide to take a different approach on that. So you could have more than one original attorney, and you could only appoint the successor once all of the original attorneys' appointments have ended. Or you might want to appoint more than one successor at a time. So if the donor has just got their spouse or partner as attorney to start with, but they might then want to appoint all of their children jointly as successor attorneys. If you want to take different approaches, you'll have to get some specific advice on that, or at least do that through the additional terms section, because it's very flexible in terms of how that might work. Let's say here we just want to do one successor attorney, because you can always redo your power of attorney later on if your original and your successor attorneys aren't available. It might be time for a change anyway. So here, like with the original attorney details, we've got a choice whether this is an individual or a trustee corporation. So we might want our successor attorney to be a trustee corporation, in this case as a backup, in which case we could come here and select one of these. With an enduring power of attorney for property, that's probably not such a bad thing, as that's sort of thing that they are more capable of being able to do. And so here we might say, let's go trustees executors, in which case the details of trustees executors will automatically pull through, other than phone number, email address, which you don't necessarily need to complete. And so that would cover off how we appoint our successor attorney. Now the next thing that we need to do is, up here in our optional provisions, we said that we wanted to have some consultation obligations. And so here we come down to consultation, and we can decide who would need to be consulted on various matters. So let's say that Brian wanted to have his brother Paul consulted. So we choose the relationship. Again, we could include the contact details if we want to, although it's not necessary. And so you can choose whether Paul needs to be consulted on everything or only on specified matters. Now, if you chose all matters, that would be probably unworkable in practice because to have to consult on every single thing that might come up would be a pretty onerous obligation, and it would make it difficult for the attorney and probably slow them down in terms of being able to act quickly in circumstances where they needed to do that to protect the donor. So you could try and make this subject to some level of materiality, or you could enter some specific matters. And so earlier on, I was looking at whether or not it should be possible to be able to sell the family home, and we could have had a condition